the dense Bwindi forest in 1998, an event occurred that was not merely a skirmish between animals. Shani, a female gorilla, defying all known laws of nature, organized a military-style raid, seized territory, and took prisoners. This was no accident. It was followed by 25 years of observations that showed she had built her own empire with a clear social structure. And now, science asks one question. If a gorilla can engage in politics, then it means we never truly understood who they really are. The silence of Bwindi was shattered not by a single cry, but by a cascading wave of alarm calls. This wasn't chaos. There was order in it, a rhythm. Shani, a seasoned female with a distinctive gray patch on her shoulder, was already standing at the border of her territory. She did not look back at her silverback male. Her gaze, heavy and intentional, was fixed ahead into the thick wall of vines where a neighboring group was feeding. She took the first step. Behind her, as if following an invisible command, others moved, 2 adult females and several adolescents. This was not a panicked flight or a random clash. This was a raid. They crossed the neutral zone and slammed into someone else's feeding ground. The scene lasted less than 20 minutes. There was no lethal combat between males, only short, fierce skirmishes, mostly noise and display. The neighboring male, caught off guard, retreated with his group. Shani, however, remained. She walked around the captured patch of forest, methodically marking the trees. And then something happened that didn't fit into any field report. A young male from the defeated group, about 6 years old, did not leave with his own kind. He froze on the outskirts, watching, and Shani allowed him to stay. Stop. Female gorillas do not lead wars. This is an axiom confirmed by decades of observations by George Schaller and Diane Fossey. Females leave their natal group during adolescence to join unfamiliar males. This is their only social strategy. They do not seize territories. They do not organize intergroup attacks, and they certainly do not take, quote, zero, especially young males who, in the traditional model, are competitors and a threat to the harem. A 1995 primatology textbook lying in the field camp back then described gorillas as, quote, 1. In 20 minutes, Shani tore that page out and crumpled it up. This wasn't just one broken rule. It was a total collapse of expectations. She didn't just show aggression. She planned and led it. She didn't just fight for resources. She appropriated the land. And she didn't drive away the strange young male, a potential problem, but effectively granted him amnesty, integrating him into her system. In 1998, in the Windy Mountains, something bigger than an animal skirmish occurred. A glitch happened in the very matrix of our understanding. Was it a random failure, a genetic fluke in a single individual? Or was it a systemic failure in our definitions, in our neat frameworks where we try to squeeze the living, unpredictable world? To answer this, we must check the very foundation. That means we must start from the very beginning, from that very simple and obvious picture that Shani shattered today. The textbook page lay under a lamp in the Bwindi field camp, its text seeming monolithic, carved in stone. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, to, underscore, underscore. George Schaller observed them in the 1960s for 455 days in the Virunga National Park and derived this model. Diane Fossey, working with mountain gorillas in Rwanda, confirmed it. Females leave their natal group at the age of 6 to 8 years to join a new male. It was an axiom. It explained everything. But axioms in science are not laws of nature. They are convenient frames into which we place the chaos of observations so that it becomes understandable. And sometimes, the chaos begins to stir quietly inside those frames until they crack. In 1979, in that same Rwanda, a researcher from the Fosse Project noted a short entry in a diary. A female from Group 5 exhibited underscore underscore quote underscore 3 underscore underscore toward neighbors, even though her silverback male remained passive. The entry was marked as a quote underscore 4 underscore and forgotten. In 1988, in another group, a young male who should have been driven out remained on the periphery of the territory for almost 3 months, maintaining strange, incomprehensible contacts with the females. This was dismissed as underscore underscore quote underscore 5 underscore underscore. In 1994, just 4 years before Shawnee's raid, an incident was observed in Buwindi, where 2 females from different groups jointly defended a water source against a third group. The report on this lay in the same stack of papers as the textbook. Its title was underscore underscore quote underscore 6 underscore underscore, and the conclusion stated underscore underscore quote underscore 7 underscore underscore. The structure didn't crack loudly. It creaked quietly at the edges, like old ice on a lake. After that day in 1998, when Shawnee returned with a captured plot of land and a young male captive, a conversation began in the camp that felt more like a revision of the foundation itself. One researcher, a young man, quoted the textbook again, trying to find an explanation in a genetic anomaly. Another, experienced, with gray hair at his temples, silently reached for the stack of old reports. He said nothing until he found that 1994 document. He placed it next to the fresh notes about Shawnee. "Look," he said simply. And that was enough. On 2 pages, separated by 4 years, lay not 2 exceptions. They lay like 2 pieces of a single pattern that we didn't want to see because it didn't fit into the convenient frame of peaceful, phylogenetically conservative giants. Females could show aggression. They could cooperate. They could, in rare, strange cases, break the strict rules of transfer. Shawnee didn't tear a page out of the textbook. She merely made the final, most decisive rip on a page that was already riddled with tiny cracks. If the rules were no longer absolute, was her act just an extreme exception? Or was it the logical development of a trend we hadn't noticed because we didn't want to see it? The researcher closed both folders, but on a blank sheet of paper, he began to draw, not the usual diagram of a harem structure. He was drawing a network. Arrows from one group to another, intersecting lines, nodes labeled underscore underscore quote underscore 12 underscore 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 quote underscore 13 underscore 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 quote underscore 14 underscore underscore. It wasn't a diagram of what should be. It was an attempt to schematize what was already happening. And the central node in this network, of course, was Shawnee. But now she was not an isolated anomaly. She was the point where all the small cracks merged into one single rift. Shawnee first saw real power at the age of 9. It wasn't her silverback male who walked thunderously through the forest, making everyone retreat. It was an adult female from her natal group who stood before him and did not move. She didn't scream, didn't beat her chest. She just stood there, her eyes 2 black dots focused intently on his muzzle. And he stopped. He didn't retreat, but he halted his march. It wasn't a demonstration of power, but a demonstration of right. Shawnee watched from the bushes then, her brain weighing about 430 grams, slightly less than a can of tuna, recording the details. The female's body posture, the angle of her head, the reactions of the other group members. She didn't feel fear. She felt interest. Genetic analysis of her blood, taken in 2005 as part of the Buwindi Gorilla Project, showed deviations in 2 specific areas: One was related to the DRD4 gene, responsible for regulating the neurotransmitter dopamine and influencing exploratory behavior and response to novelty. Shawnee had a combination found in only 2% of the gorilla population. The second was in the MAOA gene, linked to aggression and social adaptability. These markers weren't a mutation, but a rare combination of already existing variants. When Dr. Liza Thornton, the project's lead geneticist, received the results, her first comment was, 1-5. But a week later, she added, 1-6. Strategy is not a genetic code. It is a sequence of actions calculated for a result. In the period between her adolescence and the moment she became an adult female in a new group, Shawnee executed 3 maneuvers that weren't recorded in standard field notes as significant. First, she systematically approached foraging females from another part of the territory, avoiding direct contact with the silverback male. This wasn't random movement. This was a study of boundaries. Second, when one of the females in her group fell ill and became less active, Shawnee began sharing food with her, not just sitting nearby, but physically handing over plant parts. This behavior had been observed in only 5% of adult females in Burundi during the entire observation period up to 1998. Third, in a conflict between 2 young males, she supported neither, but after one was driven out, she crossed the neutral zone 3 times and found him on the periphery of a neighboring group. These meetings were brief, without physical contact, but they happened. She was creating connections outside the harem. When researchers in 2002, after the raid, gathered these scattered notes from different journals and compared them with the genetic profile, the picture didn't become clearer, but more complex. Genes could explain her willingness to take risks, her persistence, but they didn't explain her politics. Forming coalitions with weaker females within the group to increase her influence is not instinct. It is a tactic. Seeking and establishing contacts with exiled males outside the group is not looking for a mate. It is building a network of potential allies. If you look at this through the prism of human history, it resembles the early stages of forming alliances in fragmented societies. But the gorilla hadn't read history. She acted within the framework of her world, using the tools she had: attention, memory, and the ability to distinguish social statuses. The question now stopped being, why did she do it? It became, what had she been doing all those years? The 1998 raid was not a sudden explosion. It was the culmination. It was a logical step in a chain that began on the day when 9-year-old Shawnee saw a female who stopped a silverback male not through force, but through her mere presence. She wasn't just breaking the rules. She was studying their limits, and then she began to rewrite them for herself. So, was Shawnee unique? Genetically, yes, her profile was rare. Situationally, also, yes. She found herself in a group with a relatively weak silverback male and in a region with a high density of groups where competition for resources was intense. But this combination created more than just an anomaly. It created laboratory conditions in which a latent ability of the species, social plasticity, could manifest to its full extent. If this was nature's experiment, then the next question is obvious. Were other gorillas in other parts of the forest capable of the same? And if so, what had we been observing all those previous decades? The true nature of the species, or merely one of its possible configurations, fixed by chance? The first day on the captured plot did not begin with a celebration. Shawnee walked the boundaries slowly and methodically. She didn't beat her chest, she didn't tear at the leaves. She touched the trees with her palm, checking the bark as if studying the properties of a new material. The young male, that 6-year-old captive, kept a distance of 15 meters. He didn't try to approach the females, nor did he make any attempt to take a central position. He simply fed on the periphery, but his eyes constantly followed Shawnee. This wasn't submission. This was waiting for instructions. The instructions appeared a week later. When the group moved to a new water source, Shawnee allowed the male to close the distance to 10 meters. He became a kind of outer perimeter. If the silverback male moved in front and the females were in the center, then this young male took a position to the side, covering the flank. He wasn't guarding the females. He was guarding the space. This was the first role in the new architecture, the peripheral protector. He received no privileges. Access to the best foraging spots remained with the main harem. But he gained safety and a sense of belonging. In the classic model, an exiled young male either dies or wanders alone for years until he can gather his own group. Here, he was accepted into the system, but on certain terms. This wasn't chaos. This was a treaty. The next young male appeared 2 years later, in 2000. He was slightly older, about 8 years old, and had been driven out of a neighboring group after a conflict. Shawnee did not organize a new raid. She allowed him to approach on neutral ground. Observations over 3 weeks showed a sequence. First, he fed out of the group's sight. Then Shawnee began to appear at the edge of her territory on the days when he was nearby. They did not interact physically. But after a month of such visual contacts, she allowed him to enter the peripheral zone, taking a position next to the first accepted male. Now she had 2 external protectors. Their role became clear in 2001, when a third group tried to penetrate the territory. The silverback male took a central position, ready for direct confrontation. But no clash occurred. The 2 young males, positioned on different flanks, began to demonstratively mark the border, beating their chests and breaking branches. They created the illusion of numerical superiority and an expanded defense. The neighboring group retreated without direct contact. Shawnee did not participate in this. She watched from the center. This wasn't the protection of a harem by a single male. This was the defense of a territory by a distributed network of forces. By 2005, Shawnee's group was no longer a classic harem. It was a structure with a core, the silverback male and 5 adult females with infants, and a periphery consisting of 3 accepted young males. These males were not outcasts. They were functional units. They expanded the safe foraging zone, patrolled the borders, and, in rare cases, even engaged in limited interactions with the main group's adolescents, playing and demonstrating feeding techniques. They had no right to mate with the core females, but they were part of the social body. The birth dynamics within the group increased by 40% compared to the average figures for Bwindi during the 1990 to 1995 period. The group's territory expanded from the original 4.2 square kilometers to 6.1 square kilometers, an area comparable to a small city park. This was not random growth. It was a managed expansion. If you look at this through the lens of human history, it resembles not an empire, but rather early military alliances, where defeated or exiled warriors could be incorporated into the victor's army under specific conditions, serving on the outskirts and protecting the borders in exchange for patronage and resources. But the guerrilla had not read the history of steppe nomads. She acted within the possibilities of her species, utilizing memory, observation, and the ability to distinguish social statuses. Shawnee was not creating laws. She was creating practices that worked, and they worked sustainably. Observations from 2010 showed that the first accepted male, now a fully grown 10-year-old silverback, remained in the group. He did not attempt to seize control or create his own harem within. He occupied his own niche. When the core silverback male died of an illness in 2012, the structure did not collapse. Shawnee and the adult core females continued to manage the territory, while the peripheral males intensified their patrolling activity. A new silverback male joined the group only a year and a half later, and he was accepted not as an absolute ruler, but rather as a new element in an already existing stable system. The system became primary, while the individual status of the male became secondary. This was a laboratory of nature, but a laboratory that functioned for 25 years. It produced not just data, but a new social configuration, and then a next. Deeper question arises. Was this laboratory a unique chamber, or was it simply the first to show us what might have been happening in other parts of the forest, hidden from observers? In 2015, in the Ruhija sector, just 40 kilometers from Shawnee's group, researchers from the MGV project noted the behavior of an adult female in group N9. This female, named Kaya, began to form stable alliances with two other females within the group, often cooperating to protect specific foraging spots from other group members. 3 times during the observation period, she also crossed the neutral zone for short, non-aggressive contacts with an exiled young male from a neighboring group. These contacts did not lead to the male's acceptance, but they happened. They violated the standard model of __quote_21__. Kaya did not conduct a raid, and she did not seize territory, but she demonstrated a social plasticity that, until 1998, was considered impossible. She was not Shawnee, but she was her faint, blurred reflection in another part of the forest. What if gorillas were always capable of this? What if we were observing not the true nature of the species, but only one of its possible configurations, fixed by certain ecological conditions and our own tendency to see order where it is convenient? Shawnee did not rewrite the rules with a single action. She showed that the rules were a draft, and that the forest holds other versions of the text. Kato stood at the edge of the water source. His body, covered in fur that was already beginning to silver at the shoulders, remained motionless. 2 teenagers from the core of the group, one of them was Shawnee's son, clashed near the cliff, their shouts sounding more playful, yet their postures grew tense. Kato did not shout. He approached slowly, took a position between them, and simply placed his massive palm on each of their shoulders. He applied pressure, not aggressively, but firmly. The playful skirmish ceased. They moved apart and continued to feed. Kato remained in place, watching. This was not just a prevented fight. It was a demonstration of status. He was not merely a peripheral protector. He was the regulator of internal order. His acceptance was total. But this confidence, this integration, was built on a foundation that began with a complete collapse. 8 years ago, in the year 2000, he was not Kato. He was a young, nameless male, exiled from his native group after a failed attempt to approach one of the females. His last memory of that time was not of a fight, but of the cold. He stood at the border, and the silverback male of his group, weighing about 180 kilograms, more than 2 adult men, simply turned and walked away. The others followed. He was left alone. For the first 3 days, he did not eat. He just sat in one spot, his brain, which weighed little more than a can of tuna at the time, filled not with strategy, but with emptiness. It wasn't loneliness. It was dissolution. Shawnee appeared on the 4th day. She did not approach immediately. She fed on her territory about 50 meters away from him. He watched her movements, methodical, confident. He saw how the other females in her group followed her without any obvious pressure. He saw 2 other young males, already accepted, who occupied positions on the periphery. He watched for a week. And then, one day, when he took a step toward the edge of the neutral zone, Shawnee turned her head and looked directly at him. It was not a look of threat. It was a look of assessment. She allowed him to enter within a distance of 10 meters. He became part of the background. The first months were a period of silent learning. He learned to keep his distance. He learned to mark trees, not just for himself, but in a specific sequence. First the lower branches, then the base. This was not his innate habit. It was a behavior he subconsciously copied from the first accepted male. He became part of the system, but he did not understand its rules. And this led to a mistake. In 2001, a year after his acceptance, the group encountered neighbors at the far edge of the territory. Kato, feeling his new role, moved forward too quickly. He began to demonstratively beat his chest and break branches. His cries were louder and more aggressive than those of the others. He almost crossed the neutral zone, approaching the silverback male of the other group at a dangerous distance, less than 5 meters. In a classic model, this would have instantly provoked a deadly struggle. But no fight occurred, because Shawnee moved. She did not scream. She simply walked through the group, her body weighing about 90 kilograms, moving with purposeful slowness. She stood directly in front of Kato, blocking his path to the potential opponent. Then she turned, and her palm, not for a strike but for guidance, touched his shoulder. She began to lead him back, gently but relentlessly, away from the conflict. He resisted at first, making short sounds of protest, but then he followed. She led him about 30 meters away, apart from the main group, and stayed by his side until the situation at the border was resolved without his involvement. This was not a punishment. This was education. She showed him the limits of his role, to protect, but not to provoke, to create an appearance of strength, but not to risk the structure. This was a level of social upbringing that, until that moment, had been considered impossible for gorillas. He wasn't just accepted, he was adapted. After that, his behavior changed. He became not just a protector, but a strategist. In 2003, when the group was moving through a narrow pass, he took a position not at the side as usual, but in front, scouting the path and returning to lead the group through the safe sections. In 2005, he began interacting with the core adolescents not only during conflicts but also in teaching, showing them how to break apart particularly tough plant stems. He became part of the social fabric, and his integration was now not physical but functional. Shawnee watched. She watched him that day by the water source when he resolved a conflict between the adolescents. She watched his border patrols, which became not just marking but analysis. He stayed in places where other groups appeared more often, and his presence there reduced the frequency of clashes by 70%, according to 2007 observation data. His story was complete. He was proof that the system worked not as a random set of actions, but as a repeatable, teachable process. But Shawnee had not finished her work with him. She had finished a cycle. After that day at the spring, when Kato returned to his duties, Shawnee turned her head and looked not at him, but toward the opposite side of the forest. On the far edge of the territory, beyond the tree line, a new figure appeared, a young male, exiled from another group. He stood motionless, watching. Shawnee did not move toward him immediately. She simply watched. This was not the end of one story. It was the beginning of the next. The stack of old reports on Dr. Tucker's desk was about 30 centimeters high, like a standard block of printer paper. To the right lay another, slightly higher, with observation files on Shawnee's group over the last 25 years. Between them stood a 1995 textbook, __quote_22__. Its cover was dark blue, and the pages inside were a monolith of text, which Tucker had been quoting to students for 10 years. He placed his palm on the textbook, closed it, and slowly moved it to the left stack. This was not just an action. It was an act of a burial ritual, the closing of an entire era of understanding. The first data on Shawnee in 1999 was marked as __quote_23__, horizontally inconsistent activity. It was a mild term for something that does not fit the model. Tucker wrote in the report back then, underscore underscore quote underscore 24 underscore underscore. He was certain. The textbook lay on the same desk, open to page 47, where the harem structure was described as underscore underscore quote underscore 25 underscore underscore. Certainty was convenient. It allowed him not to reevaluate everything else. But the stack on the right was growing. Each year added a new file, territory expansion by 0.3 square kilometers, integration of a new young male, changes in border marking patterns. In 2007, a graph appeared that Tucker initially rejected. It showed a non-linear growth of social connections within the group, not just an increase in the number of members, but an increase in the number of interactions between them. Connections between peripheral males and core females. Connections between peripheral males with each other. It was a network, not a pyramid. Tucker sent the graph to a statistician for verification. The answer was underscore underscore quote underscore 26 underscore underscore. And then Tucker opened the left stack. He didn't start reading the textbook. He began digging through old reports, the ones that sat in the archives as historical background, not as data. A 1994 report about the joint defense of water by two females from different groups. A 1988 note about a young male who remained on the periphery for 3 months after being exiled. 1979 records from Rwanda about an unusually aggressive female. They were scattered, labeled as situational, stress-related, or immature. He laid them out on the table next to the graph of Shawnee's group network. The conversation in his office in 2010 was quiet. His colleague, a young postdoc, was still trying to find an explanation in genetics. Underscore underscore quote underscore 31 underscore underscore. Tucker remained silent for a minute. He looked at the 2 stacks of papers and said, underscore underscore quote underscore 32 underscore underscore. It wasn't panic. It was a cold, methodical revision, like an engineer who discovered that the foundation of a house was built on a map, not on the soil. If Shawnee was not a genetic glitch, but a logical consequence of the species' latent possibilities, then the 1995 textbook was not a description of nature. It was a description of one of its possible configurations, fixed by a random combination of conditions: low group density, a certain distribution of resources, our own tendency to see order where it is convenient. Tucker took a blank sheet of paper. He didn't start drawing a new diagram of the harem structure. He started drawing a map. But it wasn't a map of the Bwindi territory with group boundaries. It was a map of possibilities. It didn't have dots for Group A or Group B. It had areas, high density, limited resources, age composition. And in the center, as the intersection point of all these conditions, was Shawnee. She was not an anomaly. She was a symptom of the fact that the species possesses a social plasticity that we haven't seen because our observation tools were tuned to look for stability rather than to look for change. The question now became not, quote, 38. It became, quote, 39. If a gorilla can reorganize its social structure under environmental pressure, then what have we missed in chimpanzees, capuchins, or dolphins? Our categories of, quote, 40 or, quote, 41 are just our crutches. Reality isn't divided into peace and war. It is divided into strategies. And the forest, the ocean, the steppe are full of strategies that we don't see because we don't want to look. Tucker closed the folder with the graphs. He opened a new file on his computer, not for an article, for a project. The first line was, Goal: a systematic search for latent social structures in the Bwindi population. Do not study exceptions. Look for trends. He sent an email to a colleague in Rwanda, to a project that continued to work according to the Schaller model. The text was short. We need to review all the archives, not as a data repository, as a repository of missed opportunities. Shawnee's story did not end. She became a tool, and this tool is now aimed at more than just gorillas. It is aimed at scientific vision itself. The next step is not more observations of a single group in Bwindi. It is an observation of ourselves, of how we, the observers, learn to see what has always been before us, but outside the scope of our comfortable categories. And in the forest, 40 kilometers from Tucker's office, a young female from Group N9 in the Ruhija sector took a step toward the border of her territory. She wasn't organizing a raid. She was simply observing an exiled male in the neutral zone. It was not an act of aggression. It was an act of attention. And somewhere in the archives, in a stack of papers on the left side of the desk, there already lay a record of similar behavior from 1994, marked as __quote_44___. Now it will be relabeled, not as an exception, as a possible trend. Kato, now a full silverback, stood in the rain at the border of the territory he had guarded for 15 years. His palm, as wide as a human head, slowly touched the base of an ancient tree, not for marking, but for checking. He felt the texture of the bark, the moisture, the traces of another group that had passed through here. It was not a ritual. It was an analysis. Further on, in the center of the group, 2 adult females were distributing adolescents for feeding in a new area captured last year. The system worked without commands. It worked by memory. In Dr. Tucker's office at the University of Cambridge, there was no desk. Instead, there stood a vertical light panel the size of a door, dynamically displaying a map of the social connections of the entire Bwindi population over the last 30 years. 37 groups, 284 individual profiles. Blue lines indicated traditional harem bonds. Red lines showed observed cooperative interactions between groups. Green lines represented accepted peripheral males. The center of the map was a dense knot of red and green lines. This was Shawnee's group, no longer a point, but an entire network. __quote_46___ Tucker told the new team, 6 young researchers with tablets instead of notebooks. Quote 47, quote 48. He wasn't quoting textbooks. He was quoting databases. One of the researchers, a girl with short dark hair, raised her hand. But the Schaller model? The Schaller model was a map for a traveler in 1960, Tucker replied without looking at her. He poked a finger at the light panel. This is a map for a pilot in 2023. It doesn't show the roads that exist. It shows the roads that could be. On the panel, green lines began to appear not only in the center. They spread like faint sprouts into other sectors, Ruhija, Kitse, and Kuru. These were not anomalies. These were trends. The old archives no longer lay in stacks, but in a digital vault. Every entry previously marked as insignificant or stress-related was relabeled and linked to new observations. A 1994 report about 2 females jointly protecting water now had a hyperlink to a 2019 video where a female from Group N9 did the same thing. The difference was not in the behavior. The difference was in the category. Situational behavior became a cooperative strategy. The DRD4 and MAOA genetic profiles found in Shawnee were now no longer an explanation for a single gorilla. They were a filter for searching. The database scanned the population, identifying other individuals with similar combinations. At the time of Tucker's presentation, 7 had been found. 2 of them were already exhibiting behavior classified as political maneuvering, forming stable alliances within the group and attempting to establish contacts outside of it. Shawnee was not genetically unique. She was simply the first one in whom a genetic predisposition met ideal ecological conditions. high group density, a weak silverback male, and perhaps, quite simply, historical necessity. The finale is not in the Buindi forest. The finale is within the sight of a young researcher, that same short-haired girl. She stands at the edge of the neutral zone in the Kiteze sector, 50 kilometers away from Shawnee's group. Data about the local group flows into her tablet in real time. She observes an adult female slowly approaching an exiled young male. The female shows no aggression. She holds out a branch with fruit to him. The girl does not record this in her notebook as an unusual interaction. She taps code S7 on her tablet. Potential intergroup cooperative behavior. The system automatically links this event to the female's genetic profile, which is already uploaded, and to historical data from the 1979 archive. Another faint green line appears on the light panel in Tucker's office. This is not the end of Shawnee's story. This is the beginning of a science that has learned to see not exceptions, but a spectrum. Kato, back in the forest, continues his analysis of the boundary. The girl in Kiteze continues to enter data. Tucker in Cambridge continues to build a map of possibilities. The question posed 25 years ago by a single female in Buindi is no longer, why her? It is now, what have we missed in the others? And the tool for the answer is no longer field notes. It is an algorithm that is learning to recognize latent structures within the chaos of behavior. It is learning to see gorillas not as a species, but as a collection of individual strategies, each of which can be read if one abandons the pre-written script. And when you look at the map on the light panel, where green lines are slowly but inevitably spreading across the entire network, you realize that this is not a data map. It is a map of the future. A future in which the category of gorilla will be not a definition, but a question. And the question, what are we still not seeing, will not be the end of the research, but its constant beginning.